You are watching Genos Historia. This video is episode 6 of my 8-episode series on Viking ancient DNA. Here in episode 6, I'll be explaining to you the truth about Viking genetic diversity. I decided to make this episode about diversity because in the online articles, in the media coverage about Viking DNA, all they talk about is genetic diversity, but they describe it extremely inaccurately. So what I want to do for you in this episode is explain to you what Viking genetic diversity actually was and what it tells us about Viking history. But first, I need to be honest with you about the reason why the online articles describe it so inaccurately. It's not because they made innocent mistakes. It's because they did it on purpose. They did it for political reasons. They were doing it in order to deconstruct Scandinavian identity, because in left-wing politics, they think when Europeans have an identity, that's a bad thing. So they cherry-picked and distorted the DNA evidence in order to try to deconstruct Scandinavian identity. I'm not screeching and hollering about this. I'm just telling you that's what's going on with these online articles. I'm not going to sugarcoat that truth because it's controversial. Anyways, the way I'm going to do this episode is I'm going to debunk the two main supporting claims they made in the online articles, while also telling you the actual truth about Viking diversity and what it tells us about Viking history. I also need to remind you, like I do in all my videos, the opinions I express here are my own opinions of the ancient DNA, based on my own analysis of it, mainly using the G25 PCA from the Eurogenes blog. Alright, so the first supporting claim to debunk that was used in the online articles was this claim that they had that the DNA shows being a Viking was simply a job that was not specific to people with Scandinavian ancestry, but it was this job that people from multiple ethnic groups would do. I saw this being pushed in almost every online article, especially the most popular ones. And if you've watched my previous episodes in this series, you know this is not the case, because I looked at a lot of DNA samples from actual Vikings, people we know were Vikings from their burials. 67 of them in total, all of them outside of Scandinavia. 97% of them had Scandinavian ancestry. Now, like I said in the beginning, this is according to my own analysis of the DNA using the G25 PCA. I did the analysis of the DNA before I read the online articles, and when I read the online articles, I'm like, these people, where do they get this information? Because this is not what I'm seeing at all when I'm looking at the DNA. I'm seeing that 97% of these Vikings had Scandinavian ancestry. 27% of them were mixed, meaning they had Scandinavian ancestry in addition to another type of ancestry. But this doesn't mean that Vikings were multi-ethnic. I think although being mixed, they would have ethnically identified as Norse, because I think that they were basically Norse dispersal. I explained what Norse dispersal were a lot in my video about DNA from early settlers in Iceland and Greenland. They were people that grew up in Viking colonies outside of Scandinavia. Apparently, looking at the DNA, they often had mixed ancestry, but we can know from the history, would have ethnically identified as Norse, would have spoke Norse as their native language. So although we see many, or 27% of the Vikings are mixed, ethnically they would have been Norse, and we can probably, at least I think, can conclude that almost all these Viking DNA samples we have were ethnically Norse. They were not multi-ethnic like what the online articles try to tell you. Overall, what it tells us about Viking history, looking at these Vikings and just looking at DNA samples from Viking settlements outside of Scandinavia in general, is that it was common for them to intermarry with people in the surrounding native communities surrounding their colonies. We see this in Viking settlements in Russia, in Ireland, in Iceland, Greenland. It's a consistent pattern. That's the diversity we see. The diversity is not that Vikings came from multiple ethnic backgrounds, it's that they would intermix with people often. Okay, moving on to the second major supporting claim made in most of the online articles about this Viking DNA, which is the claim that there was Southern European and Asian gene flow into Scandinavia before and during the Viking Age. Now, the reason that they do this is they want you to believe that even before the Viking Age, Scandinavians weren't really Scandinavian. They were a melting pot of the world, and they want you to believe they weren't even really European, which is why they say Asian gene flow. Also, unfortunately, but unsurprisingly, this claim comes from one of the researchers from the Viking DNA study. Don't make his title of researcher make you think that he's beyond being wrong and beyond intentionally distorting DNA, because that's exactly what he did here. I know it came from him because he's quoted in several of the articles saying this. This is where they got this claim from. When he says this happened before the Viking Age, it confuses me because it goes against everything we know about prehistoric European genetic history, which we know really well from literally thousands of ancient DNA samples. I think he knew that only people who study it, like me, understand it, so he took advantage of the ignorance of the journalist, ignorance of the general public, and knew he could kind of distort that prehistoric history and make it seem as if there's this recent gene flow before the Viking Age into Scandinavia from southern Europe and Asia. This is not the case. What we know from prehistoric European genetic history from ancient DNA is the last time there was gene flow from outside of northern Europe into Scandinavia was in the 3rd millennium BC, a whole 3,000 to 4,000 years before the Viking Age. So it wasn't like recently before the Viking Age like he tried to make it seem. And he was even wrong about where it came from. It didn't come from southern Europe, and it didn't come from Asia. It came from the steppes of Ukraine and Eastern Europe, from a people who I call the Kurgans, who are interestingly enough the main ancestors of Scandinavians, which I'll get into in my next video. Now, as for his claim that there is gene flow from southern Europe and Asia into Scandinavia during the Viking Age, this is also untrue. I looked at the DNA a lot. There was, from what I can see, looking at it with the G25 PCA, there was a lot of gene flow into Scandinavia during the Viking Age, but none of it came from southern Europe, and definitely none of it came from Asia. I mean, the fact he doesn't even mention a specific region in Asia kind of hints to you that he's either using a really bad analyst or tool, which isn't specific, or he's distorting the DNA evidence. All the gene flow into Scandinavia in the Viking Age came from other regions in northern Europe. And this should not surprise anyone because Vikings were only active in northern Europe. They didn't do a lot in the southern part of Europe, so people there didn't have a reason or a way to migrate to Scandinavia. You would think that the journalists, if they knew anything about Viking history, would ask this guy that question, like why would you say that gene flow is coming from southern Europe if Vikings weren't really active there? But of course, they're either ignorant or they're dishonest, so they didn't ask those critical questions. The regions in northern Europe it came from were the British Isles, France, Germany, the Eastern Baltic, and Russia. It did come from a few other regions in northern Europe like Poland and Lapland, but almost all of it came from those specific regions. And there was a lot of gene flow. So in the pie charts, you can see I have the proportions of people who were 100% Scandinavian, mixed, and 100% foreign in the DNA samples from each Scandinavian country. I have Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and then the Swedish island of Gotlin I have separate because its foreigners are distinct from the ones in mainland Sweden, which I'll describe in a little bit. You can see that in Norway, there was not much foreign gene flow. The vast majority of the samples there are 100% Scandinavian. So this foreign gene flow into Viking Age Scandinavia is pretty much only about Denmark and Sweden. Only about 1/3 of the DNA samples from there are 100% Scandinavian. And in the Swedish island of Gotlin, it's only 17%. So the majority of the samples from Viking Age Sweden and Denmark are mixed or 100% foreign. Now this is an impressive amount of foreign gene flow, but don't get too excited about it because I do suspect it's inflated due to sampling bias. What I think the sampling bias is there's lots of DNA samples from explicitly Christian burials, some of them literally from church cemeteries, but there are almost no DNA samples from explicitly pagan burials and definitely not from explicitly pagan cemeteries. I did find a few burials with a Thor hammer's necklace, but that's it. The reason why this will inflate the numbers of people with foreign ancestry is because Scandinavia during the Viking Age was the last place in Western Europe which was still mostly pagan. The rest of Western Europe had become completely Christian. So if you get a lot of DNA samples from explicitly Christian burials when the population of Scandinavia itself was still largely pagan, you're definitely going to get an overrepresentation of foreigners from those DNA samples. More support of this idea of sampling bias is the high amount of people with 100% French and German ancestry. French and German by far are the most common types of foreign ancestry in Viking Age Sweden and Denmark. I'm putting them in the same category for reasons I explain in the links in the description, which I can't get into in this video. In Sweden, 29% of the samples are 100% French or German. In Denmark, 23% of the samples are. Those numbers are almost equal to the numbers of samples who are 100% Scandinavian in both countries. So there were clearly lots of people from France and Germany. The reason why I say they support the idea of sampling bias is because I have a little theory that I have is that a lot of these people were church ministers or just involved in the establishment of the Christian church in Scandinavia, coming from France and Germany. That's just a little theory. I'm not like super strong about it. I'm just throwing it out there. One cool example, which is evidence of this, are 9 DNA samples which were taken from a church cemetery in Ribby, Denmark. From as far as I know, was the first official church built in Scandinavia. It was built by a German bishopric. 7 of 9 of the DNA samples there are 100% French-German or mixed French-German and Scandinavian. So a lot of French and German people in the cemetery of the first church built in Scandinavia. That's pretty interesting. Now as for the Viking Age samples in Scandinavia with Baltic, Russian, and British ancestry, the majority of them were mixed with Scandinavian ancestry, which makes me think they came from Viking colonies in England and Russia. In other words, I think they were Norse dispersal. Like what I described earlier, Norse dispersal are basically my concept of it is basically people in the Viking colonies, their Scandinavian ancestors intermarried with people in the surrounding communities. They're mixed, but they ethnically identify as Norse. And now what I think is going on is we're seeing a pretty high proportion of them from England and Russia going back to Denmark and Sweden. But there are also some samples who are 100% British or 100% Baltic or 100% Russian. By the way, by Russian I mean Eastern Slavic, which does suggest people from the native communities in Russia, Eastern Baltic, and England were also migrating to Scandinavia in the Viking Age, so it's not all these Norse dispersal. Now, as for the Swedish island of Gotlin, like I said, I separate them as their own category because the foreigners there are distinct. The majority of them are Baltic. About 50% of the DNA samples from Gotlin are 100% Baltic, so almost all their foreigners are from modern countries of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and most of them are 100%. This isn't a huge surprise as Gotlin is geographically right in the Baltic Sea. Those countries are on the eastern side of the Baltic Sea. Scandinavia is on the western side of the Baltic Sea. They're right next door to Scandinavia, even closer to Gotlin. And I think I read in their burials, correct me if I'm wrong, these were trading centers. So these Baltic people were probably traders going to Gotlin. So something unique was going on in Gotlin, separate from what was going on in the rest of Sweden and Denmark. A few other things to point out are that the individuals with British ancestry are only found in Denmark, which is obviously because Denmark was the country that invaded England, ruled much of it for a while, and so clearly we're bringing people back from England, some of them being Norse dispersal living in England. Another thing is there are twice as many people with Baltic and Russian or Eastern Slavic ancestry in Sweden than in Denmark, which is obviously because it was Sweden that was really involved in Eastern Europe, creating colonies there, invading it. So they were clearly also bringing people back from Eastern Europe into Sweden. As for why there are also people with this Eastern European ancestry in Viking Age Denmark, I don't know how to explain that because as far as I know, Denmark was not involved in Eastern Europe. Alright, so that is what the Viking Genetic Diversity was. I explained to you here in this video in pretty good detail. To tell you in summary what I just told you is we can see in the DNA clearly that the Viking activities created a lot of gene flow and intermarriage in Europe, both inside the Viking colonies in Europe and then back into Scandinavia itself. Now this diversity does not take away the Viking identity of Scandinavians. You know, Scandinavians are proud of the Vikings because that was kind of their heyday. That's when they were the most famous. That's when they had the most power and influence in the world, when they were beating up on other countries like England. This diversity, this intermarriage and gene flow we see in the Viking DNA doesn't take that away. All it means is that when Vikings were doing their stuff, invading places, they're intermarrying with people and bringing people back into Scandinavia, which is common for seafaring, colonial type, or maybe they weren't colonial type powers, that's common for them to do, so it's really not surprising that that was going on with the Vikings. And it's really key to say this intermarriage, this gene flow, this diversity was happening because Scandinavia was initiating influence on the outside world, not the other way around. With the politically driven people in the media who are against national identities, what they'll try to tell you is this is about Scandinavia not really existing, but just being a part of this diverse array of stuff going on. Really, Scandinavian Vikings were running the show. They were causing this intermarriage to happen. They were causing people to come back to Scandinavia. So they will not tell you that in the very politically biased media. Anyways, that is it for this episode. Stay tuned for my next episode where I'll be telling you what we know about the origins of Scandinavians. If you yourself are Scandinavian, you should be especially interested in that. I'll give you better information on your origins than you could find anywhere else. I'll be covering a lot of ground in that video. I'll be showing that I really do have expert knowledge in population genetics. Something I will be covering is whether this gene flow we see going into Scandinavia from their colonies during the Viking Age contributed ancestry to modern Scandinavians. Stay tuned for that video. It's going to be interesting. I'll see you then.